Well, this recording is starting off great. I see that am I at the right agenda, Dennis? Do you have the point that we were going to talk about?
No, I don't anymore.
So we're not.
No, like technically, we reached the point when it's not needed anymore and it doesn't make sense anymore. So we just forget about it. That's fine. That's totally cool.
Okay. Cool. All right. It's funny how problems just solve themselves.
The best solution, right? Like it's just gone. No problem.
Can you summarize? Because I still not 100% certain what was.
Okay, we are getting into the rabbit's hole, but okay, you've asked for that. Yeah, it's just like I think it was like I tried to raise this point about like 1 month ago, and the problem actually popped up before that. So there was one particular milestone when I was like completely overwhelmed with the maintainership duties, and it's like we have to prioritize that, and this actually resulted in me slipping a couple of deliverables. That was really not not very pleasant feeling. It's like we all always say that like slipping deliverables is fine. Just talk to your manager, and it's like psychologically this is not really a cool thing. You know, like if you get to your manager like once in a while, that might be okay. If you do every milestone, like, you know what, we need to talk more about that. So I was just like, we'll talk openly. Like I talked to my wife and discussed this problem, you know, like because she's kind of like directly affected with that thing. Because I get to bed like at 12 or 1 a.m. and it's like, you know, not really cool. So and she said like, why don't you do this on you know, scheduled basis? I was like, well, because all Mars get into review like a different time point, and it's like you cannot really like plan that. But then we sort of discussed more of that, and I came up to the conclusion that it could be like, again, keep in mind that this is not relevant anymore because we have enough maintainers to have really like even load, and at least this milestone, maybe it's because I had vacation for 1 week, but I don't feel any pressure from the maintainership. But before it was quite overwhelming, especially closer to the feature freeze date. And the idea was that we take the maintainership team, we split them in two. One team serves maintainership duties, first half of the milestone. The second half serves the second half of the milestone. The next milestone we switch because obviously the second half of the milestone will be like more intense. So the idea was that in this case, during your maintainership duties, you always work with maintainership, and it's like if you don't have time for your deliverables, totally fine. However, if you're outside of this 2 weeks period, you work primarily with your deliverables, and it's the second team of the maintainers that serves the maintainership duties. This way, we could have the schedulable, we could have plannable sort of duties, and we could communicate to our managers saying like, okay, I dedicate half of the milestone to the company-wide duties. I'm doing maintainership, right? So let's not schedule the whole, I don't know, like what is the norm now, like 10 weights in issues or whatever. So we do not assign 10 points to me. We assign like, I don't know, 6, let's say. And the rest I'm doing the maintainership. And this would allow me to concentrate on my deliverables when I'm out of the maintainership duties. I do not pay attention to the maintainership things, and I just concentrate on my deliverables because switching context constantly, like from your deliverables to the MR getting to the maintainership, then another MR, and it's like it's really frustrating, and it's really resources consuming. So that was the main idea of like sort of giving some structure to the process. But as I said, like at least during this milestone, we have so many maintainers now that it's probably irrelevant anymore. That was as brief as I could, I guess.
No, I 100% appreciate you bringing this up because I have a lot of empathy and it happens and I feel it and I've had those similar conversations with my wife too. um, but I think it's a good point of, you know, hey, having schedules is one way to alleviate that. Having more maintainers is another way, and we kind of all naturally going to grow to more maintainers, and that's seems to have made an effect now. And I think also being able to raise IMAD capacity has been helpful. So I think with us having more, and there's a lot more visibility now too with IP's dashboard of the maintainers that are available and stuff, that we might the problem for me personally, the last few months have not been as crazy as they have been in the past. So it's been pretty good.
Totally.
I also think that maybe I've people don't like sending MRs to me because I keep asking for feedback, but that's okay. I'm just joking. Yeah, no, thanks for bringing it up, and no, thanks for summarizing the point. And it's good. I think it's good to talk about the crazy, not crazy ideas. Does anyone have any other thoughts or feelings about that?
Not that you mentioned IP's dashboard, we should probably think about baking that into GitLab if we're starting to find it really useful. There was a discussion that's mentioned that if you have a tool, an external tool that you really like, and that you build it yourself, you should probably bake it into GitLab. So we should probably start discussing that.
That is a really good idea. Yeah, that'd be kind of cool for me to see, rather than just looking at like the members page of a project, if I'd be able to see what are the available members and like see not just a list, but actually the members I'm interested in looking at. That would be really sweet. Do you want to create that issue, Jose?
Yeah, I'll work on it later today.
Awesome. Cool. That rocks. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Okay. Nico, you have a point.
Yep. If there is no other thoughts about the previous one, I'll go. So when the time permit and it's not a crazy milestone, a crazy moment of the milestone, I tend to like ask people like, you know, did maintainer review? Did you find, was it value? Was it noise? Like, do you have any feedback? And I heard that sometimes it feels like we're a bit picky on the tests. Like that's the least valuable part of our comments. And this was part of, I think also the poll that Mark did. I think it was in the results. And I feel like if we, all the maintainers, more or less all the maintainers are picky on the test, and even like without explicitly agreeing that, you know, these kind of settings that we should always comment on them are like GitLab UI classes. Maybe it makes sense to say, hey, you know, this is the reason why we do it, and this is the benefit, and this is the problem if we don't do it, as a bigger conversation with the rest of the front-end team. And I thought that before raising this directly on my own, I would share this thought in this forum and gather some thoughts here. So let me know what you think.
First of all, I would say it's not picky. It's rather that we are not picky on tests. It's like our developers tend to make more mistakes on tests than on actual code. It's not maintainers like specifically being picky on tests. It's just we find mistakes there. This is first. And second, I agree we need to clarify this, that we don't have a dedicated QA manual team. We rely on our tests like heavily. We have a mature product and so on. So yeah, let's kind of voice this on the front-end meeting, I guess.
Usually in code reviews, I think that perhaps we are not doing a great job saying why, not only what. And perhaps we can make documentation that explain the background of all of the recommendations that we are making. So it's easier for engineers to accept those recommendations.
It's also the case that we have, our documentation doesn't reflect what we consider to be best practices right now. For instance, something that's at the top of my mind is that we have some documentation which pretty much exclusively uses done callbacks in tests rather than returning promises, whereas returning promises is, I think, the preferred approach, as an example. So our documentation needs to be updated. And there's probably lots of cases of that.
There is lots of cases of that. On the note of documentation needing to be updated, sometimes that can be even feel extra burdensome when you as a maintainer, like, we do this and I see our documentation doesn't say anything about it, or it's out of date. You're like, okay, am I going to go create an MR to do all this? And Roman has had a really cool idea for maintaining just those thoughts, so that maybe we can even batch group some of these documentation updates, so you're not always having to context switch. If you go to our agenda doc, there's a link that says FAQ and precedents. It should probably say something like documentation to-dos. But this is just a Google Doc for us to keep track of. Here's things that came up in code review that we really should clarify in our documentation, because we're doing it consistently in the code base, but it's not super obvious there. And going back to talking about reasoning, yeah, it's nice to point to the documentation that says, here's why. So I don't have to reformulate a whole nother phraseology of that reason. Yeah. Yeah, this is a big deal. Leaving why in comments, what Enrique said, is huge. I want to encourage everybody to do these things. It can feel like, oh, it's just tests, I'm going to let it pass. But in my opinion, if you're seeing a pattern that I wouldn't like to see this duplicated, bring it up, because that mentoring opportunity has the highest return on investment. Because and I've noticed this with new GitLabbers, a lot of times they're used to testing component internals, and then I just end up showing them once through a patch. Here's how I would restructure this by testing the real IO of the test using parameterized specs. They look at it, they're like, oh, I get it. And then all their future MRs are like fairly on point. And so just taking time to do that pays off. Even though it may take some time in that MR, it totally pays off in future MRs, in my experience. So I want to encourage everybody to do it. And yeah, what Natalia said, it's not picky.
Also, as a thought, something I do in reviews even is, if I find that I'm saying the same thing to people a lot, I literally just, like, in where I keep my notes, will write out the thing I want to say about it, so I can just paste it into people's reviews, right? Like, it's like helpful, but it's not something, if it gets to the point that it needs to be documentation, then it's great because you've already written half the documentation. But like GitLab UI utility classes is a really good example. Like, I bring it up a bunch. You can look at the unpackaged list to see what they look like a bunch. Like, it's just easier to now have a thing. It's that and the data test ID selectors that I have the link to that one too. And I'm just like, hey, here's why you might want to do this. Here's the link. I don't have to write it twice. And it can help with explaining why. I
think it's so helpful. I've dreamed about having snippet comments for a while, and I think that's really smart. Yeah, what were you gonna say? Was someone else was speaking up too?
Yeah, I think I wanted to say something about this. I wanted to ask if, in your opinion, there is value in showing that, like, making a test more maintainable as like a huge return of investment, even though the effectiveness of the test is the same, but just because it's more maintainable, for example, because you wrote a table instead of 3 IT cases or test cases, right? How much can help yourself in the future? Because I think this is the stuff that we tend to overlook. Would it make sense to have like a session where we actually go through this and show the differences and how much can affect your speed in the future? Or is just me being too much prone on this?
I think, yeah, talking about that specific example, I would say that really skirts the line of preference over not. Like, some people really dislike the tabled parameterized specs. Like, they find it unreadable, and I can appreciate that. we all have different tastes. So I that might be a little bit more of a preference.
Yeah, no, beside the exact example, this is what came to my mind, and just like focusing on the maintainability of the test, not just the effectiveness.
Yeah, when you say like return on investment, are you talking about the maintainability of the specific discussion, or like the mentoring opportunity of like, okay, we're now more on the same page?
So the fact that if I spend like 10 more minutes now, I'm going to save 1 hour down the line, because the next time that I need to touch the component, the test is ready to accept new changes instead of having to refactor half of it because, you know, it was not taught to be expanded.
Yeah, I mean, we got to make sure we got to treat tests like production code, and hopefully that phraseology is somewhere in our documentation. And so that implies we need to try to make it not perfect, but fairly maintainable. And I think that can be offsetting to some contributors when they feel like maintainers are looking for perfection. I struggle with that because I have personal issues, and I think that just takes some really thoughtful wording sometimes. And sometimes it does take not raising issues. I like using non-blocking a lot for, hey, here's some mentoring opportunity, but I realize that this might be skirting the line a little bit. Yeah, this is a really good conversation. Do you feel like there's something to share with the broader front end team here, Nico?
Yeah, that's the question. I think there is something to share. I'm just not sure what is the best format to achieve so, right? Should it be a set of slides with some examples? Should it be a piece of code, maybe from one of us, so nobody's put on the spot, that it shows before and after? Or should it be, let's just update the docs and make known everybody that we have a more complete docs around this? That's what I'm not sure about.
Does anyone have any suggestions or ideas about it?
I think it might be nice to even make it like an ongoing thing, whether like in the front end call or like posting things to the front end channel to be so what I think about two things. One, slides are really helpful. Like every time I have a GraphQL review, I go back to Natalia's GraphQL slides to be like, did I hit the things? Because I'm like, all right, because they're great, right? They're there. It has everything I need to check. I'm like, did I check all of these things? But maybe like making those slides and then pulling out pieces for the front end meeting, or like to post in the channel, or both, because people like to know things, so that people are getting it both as a group of information, but also as little snippets so they can take it on. I don't know. I've been doing a lot of language learning lately, so now I'm just like space repetition, and then we'll all know everything.
I think that perhaps we can organize ourselves to create an epic with several issues where each of us takes the responsibility of documenting a little snippet of the testing documentation. I pasted a link in there that is called their specs, and I love those docs because first they are for Ruby, for our spec, but I've learned a lot from them. They are very small. They are just like one sentence, and then they give you one example of, hey, this is wrong, and this is the right way of doing it. So we could do something like that.
What might be really cool too, and I bringing up examples, those speak so much volumes of having actual example to look at. We have like the praise a reviewer section on our front end call. It might be cool if we had like praise a maintainable slice of our code section on the front end call, just to get other people to look at like, hey, yeah, this is a really cool way of doing this, and I can see how it's maintainable. And like almost like praising the contributors now, not for I wrote this awesome feature, like we're all writing awesome features, but just getting everybody to really appreciate and think about the maintainability aspect of it, from the test side and maybe even the production code side. And that might be something that's missing. Like we kind of do our show and tell on the front end call, but maybe what's missing is like praising other other people's stuff of like, wow, this is really cool. Like I want to check it out, and maybe here's some patterns we can start adopting. And when we talk about documentation and contributors, I've noticed like people look at the existing code as documentation a lot. And I think the more we can highlight good parts of the code versus the not so good parts, that would be really cool. Yeah, I want to get to the other points. Is everyone cool with moving? All right. Enrique, you have another point?
Well, this is the only point I have. Yeah, speaking of things that are unclear, this is another one, and it's about just snapshots. So I'm not a just snapshots user. So when I see a test that is using that tool, it's kind of difficult for me to evaluate if it is used correctly or not. We don't have documented best practices either. So I put an example in the document where, you know, there is a button that has a loading property. It is conditional. And I've seen tests that has like, you know, there is a test that it says it matches a snapshot when it's saving changes and it's not saving changes. Like it is using the same assertion, the same exact assertion for both sides of a condition. And in some ways, it feels like a very broad assertion because I don't know exactly what we are expecting from the component state. I love to have some guidelines, or, you know, if you can share your comments or how you usually, what do you usually say when you see things like this?
So I think historically people, Paul's already writing about the jest guide. I think that is the sort of source of truth, I think, for how we should approach snapshot testing, but it doesn't cover all the details. Like I don't think it really recommends how to name test descriptions, for instance. So maybe we do want to sort of import some of that into our documentation to cover things like that.
It actually does like discourage, like, don't say match a snapshot. Like you should include an assertion and the description. And what I think we've kind of discovered is if you follow those patterns, you kind of don't want to write snapshot tests because they become a lot harder to write. If I have to say the snapshot has to contain these things, you're like, well, maybe I should just assert that it contains those things. So we brought this up last meeting, and I think it sounds like it's coming up a lot. Does anybody have like really positive things to say about snapshot testing?
I have one positive thing. Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
No, you go ahead, Sarah.
The one positive thing I have to say is that for the DAG graph for SVGs, we do use it because there wasn't a way to test other rendered JavaScript. So there was one case in which it was the right thing to do, but we're still asserting other things even inside of that. That's like, there's this many links that match the mock data, just like really basic things that are still getting asserted. It's just there because in SVGs, you could get a bunch of nans or something and it will still render wrong. So basically it's like test that there's not a bunch of nans inside this snapshot, otherwise something went terribly wrong.
Yeah, that's been the only kind of exceptionally perfect snapshot use case that I've come across.
Another two that I'm aware of, one is pinning tests. So if you're going to refactor a component quite heavily, you will take a snapshot that's not supposed to live for very long in the code base of behavior before, basically capturing absolutely everything, including possibly bugs. You refactor the code and you make sure that it renders exactly the same thing. So that's one very good use case. And another is when you have very purely functional components, I guess. So a good example is GLS printf. That uses snapshot tests, I think. Pretty sure it does. But that's an excellent use case because everything in the test passes through into the snapshot. And so there's no sort of extraneous stuff there. So that's another good use case. It's very focused. It's a very simple, conceptually simple component. So.
I had
Go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Actually, it will. My comment now will involve you, Paul.
No, thanks for apologizing, but go ahead.
So I actually had a good example of using the snapshot test, and it was actually the MR that Paul reviewed, and there was there was something. I don't remember the details of that MR now, but clearly there was some bit of functionality missing that was not very obvious by just looking at the code. Yet when Paul reviewed, he was, as we all know, Paul checks pretty much everything. Like if there is a char in MR, Paul will check it. So Paul checked the snapshot, and he identified in the snapshot that something goes wrong just by looking in the generated markup, and it was really helpful, and it was very easy to spot that. Should I have looked into my own snapshots? And this is actually a good example where things like asserting the rendering of a component becomes really simple using the snapshots rather than just getting into the code.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nico.
I think this makes a lot of sense for the component that are the leaf or the component tree. And so those components tend to be UI pieces that interchange with each other. But another thing is that if you start to make a snapshot of a too broad amount of component, one inside of the other, it becomes so shaky. And recently we are seeing that, for example, the merge request that update GitLab UI, it's failing every single time because we change one attribute and now we have 10 or 15 snapshot broken because there is one attribute more or an attribute less. And I think this will become worse and worse if we don't address this.
Yeah, you bring up a good point about GitLab UI. I think the win of visual snapshots is really nice. Like, I think that wins over HTML snapshots, because HTML snapshots is like, okay, we can see some markup stuff, but what is this really? And I think I really like that GitLab UI I get to see visually, like, and it's really easy to review too. What have I really changed with this attribute thing? But it is a little concerning when things could like start breaking master. For the sake of time, I'm going to take a to-do from this. And I think I like that we're not all just saying, oh yeah, no one ever writes snapshot tests. Because I think, hey, this is a cool tool. And I think that's the point, is it's a tool for, it's a special kind of net you can lay around your code, but it doesn't replace unit testing, and it doesn't replace actual doing automated assertions. And I think maybe we need to drive that home a little bit in our own documentation, and that echoes what the Jest guide says as well. And a lot of what we're saying is like that too. Sometimes I suggest, hey, it'd be really cool if we add a snapshot test for this. So like, let's test everything in integration. Let's just get something there so we have a little warning going off if there's issues. We're at time. I had 2 points. One is that next week will be APAC time. So I just created that calendar event. Check it out. I need to update this one so that this hourly meeting is bi-weekly. And then I had a point where I was mainly just going to rant about something. We could talk about it next time. But cool. Well, thanks everybody. You guys have a great rest of the day.